Like I said, I'm the head of the localization department of Postmodern company. We are the biggest post-production and dubbing studio in Ukraine. We are part of the Film UA Corporation. This is a conglomerate of studios. 25 companies are comprising it. We are working with digital. I'm sorry for the quality of the audio. I'm going to turn my head away from the mic, not used to it. I'm going to talk about dubbing and translation that plays part in it. An interesting historical fact of dubbing. The idea initially belongs to the editor, Edwin Hopkins. Harry Pollard realized this idea in his film Showboat. The premiere of this film took place in April 1929. The studio Universal did that. There were two versions of this film, the silent film and so-called part talkie. This is when the silent film has a couple of audio scenes and songs. Two versions, because basically the film cinema theaters were not prepared for playing sound. The first Ukrainian dubbed film was The Cars. It was quite famous. Postmodern, our company, did the dubbing. At that time, we were used to hearing Russian in cinemas, and we were understanding it was quite risky to start with Ukrainian, but the project exceeded our expectations. And now we know that so many people choose Ukrainian films. Starting from 2006, we had so many majors dubbed in Ukrainian. 15 years of Ukrainian dubbing for cinemas, and we were the first for so many years. It was a moment of narcissism for me. Okay, now back on track. Let's define the terms to be clear about that and not to confuse them. There are a couple of types of adaptation. I'm now talking about cinema versions of films. First type of such adaptation is subtitling. This is the cheapest version when we see the bottom line of text in another language. The next type is audio description. I wouldn't say it's very common. This is for audio. These audio materials are usually for people deaf or difficulty hearing people. Usually, this description gives additional details that are not provided by the original audio. You could hear some details about the clothing or emotions of the actors, etc. People who have eyesight problems, they would benefit from that. Next type, voiceover. It could be called UN-style newsreel as well. So actually voiceover is what we know very well. We usually hear both original audio and the voiceover. There are no particular requirements to voiceover, just to convey the original meaning. Usually we use two actors, or there is lecturing where there is only one voice. You might remember these gobbling translation of films. Here, actors are not working very hard on the emotions or actor playing. Next type, dubbing, lip sync, or language replacement. This is our specializations. This is the most costly way of adaptation. We actually create sound recording in the target language. The audience does not hear the original audio. We add and have all the necessary sound effects in the track. This type of adaptation is conveying all the spectrum, the comprehensive spectrum of meanings, emotions, and so on. Usually we have 20 or more actors for each film. Recently we've seen high demand on less costly sound services, and we have small companies in Ukraine. We call this bastard VO dubbing. There is no analog on international market, on global market. It's luxury dubbing, luxury VO, or substandard voiceover. Okay, so kind of mixture of both types of adaptation. As a rule, one actor could do several different characters, just changing and adapting their voice a little bit. Generally, the public perceives this type of adaptation quite well. No better. Thank you. So actually, this VO dubbing became popular in Ukraine. Only the professionals involved in the real dubbing can feel the hair stood on end on their backs. A little bit about international trends. According to the statistics, the countries where they use subtitling show higher level of language command. But there are also a lot of countries that tend to dub all the films. These are Germany, Spain, Hungary, and Latin American countries. You see the infographics for Europe. Some people think that dubbing or subtitling are related to national and historical peculiarities. For example, the USA do not dub films, they just subtitle them, because the Americans feel it kind of weird when the sound does not coincide with the lip movements. In post-Soviet countries, we are used to VO or VO dubbing because we remember the early 90s experience. We heard so many different things. We are not used to quickly reading these subtitles, and we tend to enjoy the visuals on the screen.
The orange part of the graph is dubbing and VO. Most part of our territory belong, the yellow that is, so the area is quite big. Next slide, please. In Britain, Ireland, Netherlands, Portugal, Poland, and mostly the Balkan countries, content for children is dubbed, as well as high-budget blockbusters. The rest of movies are subtitled. Arguably, South Korea and Japan also went for this approach. Now, the orange zone, the salt code mixed zone. They equally dub and create subtitles. That's Turkey and Bulgaria. Source of information, Wikipedia, by the way. And magenta. those countries usually opt for dubbed version created by others. For example, French or Dutch in Belgium or Russian in Belarus. To the best of my knowledge, the majority of the countries of post-Soviet Union often resort to films dubbed in Russia. The remainder of my presentation will be about dubbing. Please don't confuse it with EO, otherwise you're going to be subjected to eternal damnation. Right then, dubbing. Every dubbed film was supported by a powerful army, mostly of invisible film, the voice actors. They are behind the scenes, but thanks to their contribution, the audience can watch Hollywood films in Ukrainian. Now they're gradually coming out of the shadow, and people know them. Next, dubbing directors. They cast actors, they look at voices that make the best match for the original idea of the film. Sound engineers. They sit for hours recording every line, and they keep track on the quality. They added the saliva out, as mentioned by the film, and other extraneous artifacts. We also have the mixing engineer. The mixing engineers are at loggerheads with us. They listen to the original track and then they add different effect. They mix it with the sound and with the effects, creating the so-called M&E track, the music and effect, because there are certain technical requirements to the music in the dubbed version. Next, dubbing coordinators. They must create schedules, book studios, mixed studios, and dubbing studios, and put all the difficult bits together. They ensure the recording, the mixing, the viewing. They also show it to our Ministry of Culture. They also have to keep in touch with the customer. Sometimes it's extremely convoluted, but at the same time, dubbing coordinator needs to be very diplomatic because, you know, creative professions attract very sensitive individuals. This is not to mention the back office. The legal officers, accountants, the logistics officers, and then we get to the alpha and omega of the dubbing. Are translators. This is only some of them, those who are relatively well known in the wider context. But there are many more of them. Notably, translators have no bearing regarding translating the names of the films, because this is the work of the marketing or the film providers, because it's their expertise to know and to choose the best name for a certain film. It is generally believed the best dubbing is when the audience thinks the film was shot in Ukrainian, in our case. So, how do you ensure that? The translator has 3 idols: content, lip sync, and deadline. They sacrifice their talent to please each of these idols or gods, and they have to be given equal sacrifices, absolutely. First, content. The translation must be very close to the original in terms of meaning, style, and emotional impact. And this is only the beginning. Now, let's zoom in. Meaning, they must be as close to the original as possible. And it's not about accurate meanings of the words. This is about idioms, metaphors, and comparisons. You need to carefully craft them. This is exciting, but can be excruciating at times. For example, when you don't know the context. So, for example, this is the Free Guy film trailer. I don't know if you can see it. So it says, I'm the rule breaker, I'm rattle chicka chicka shaker. This line is in the trailer and nobody could make sense of this. But this is what our translator did. Says, я rule breaker, карта прихована, колода цицькована. It matched the character very well. Now, God number two, a subcategory of contents. This is style. A school pupil cannot talk like a school professor. And then you got neurosurgeon, physicists, gamers. It's the translator's job to identify slang for each of these social groups. So we want the translation to sound natural. And each social category be identified with the audience. For example, if a surgeon goes to the cinema, he must identify with the surgeon on the screen and the way he speaks. Also, there are accents and dialogues. We rarely meet a French person who speaks Ukrainian or a Hungarian person who speaks Ukrainian, so it's really difficult for us to identify a foreign speaker speaking Ukrainian. What we are familiar with, though, is the Russian accent in Ukrainian. In one of our films, we had this beefy guy who was called Pyotr, and he had very strong Russian accent in his Ukrainian. And then another idea made the suggestion, how about we copy our ex-legitimate president Yanukovych? And his wife Betty, and for the Wonder Woman, they say the Amazons were supposed to speak with a slight Amazon accent, and we incorporated that characteristic in our translation. Sometimes there are copyright constraints. Therefore, we must use the existing translation that is totally out of sync with what the actor is saying on the screen. You might have heard this term, the Middle Earth, but we had an absolute ban on using the popular translation into Ukrainian of Middle Earth. Therefore, we had to say something like the medium earth in Ukrainian. The reason being the copyright constraints, not because our translator didn't know the most popular term. Much to our chagrin, we couldn't really explain it to the audience. That wasn't feasible at the time. Fun fact, in 1920s, in Japan there was a special job called benshi, the intermediary between two cultures. And benshi accompanied each film that was shown in Japan in early 1920s, 1920. Benshi means something like chatterbox, even though in the dictionary you can find a more accurate term of somebody who explains the context of a film. Because the Japanese could really make sense of what American actors were doing or saying. And they had different voices for the bad guys, bass usually, and tenor was for the good guys. For the most popular film, they used certain versions and a number of actors, which preempted dubbing as such. The third part is the emotional impact. For example, we need to make fun of the jokes. If there's some obscure British humor in the original, or anal or genital American jokes, they still need to be fun in Ukrainian. I'm sure you've seen the film that's called The Gentleman in Ukrainian. Well, I had to pick the most neutral examples from that film. So the source, it's time for you to fuck off, lads. You can see the translation into Ukrainian on the screen. The second one was "Don't stroke my mouth hair," because American films can contain some very rude language, but you need to, in your translation, you need to convey the tension of the situation. You also need to accommodate the recommendation of our distinguished Ministry of Cultures and film providers, no less distinguished, which is a lot of constraints. And it's difficult for the translator, because Ukrainian language barely have strong language with thoughts from Ukrainian, which means that we sort of lent our rude language from the family of Turk languages, so to say. Well, we might resort to some special dictionary of profanities, but this is not always acceptable for the big screens. This is one of the challenges from the Deadpool, Part 1. Like two hobos fucking in a shoe filled with piss. To make it sound adequate for the Ukrainian audience, and to make sure we didn't have problem with this, this is what the Ukrainian translator came up with. As two homeless persons who are dealing in the shoes with piss. I heard a different version. They slightly changed the grammar there. But I insist this equivalent is better. And this is a critical point, I think. And these are the subtitles. I love them. I'm just going to show you the closed caption. So, some douchebags films produced by asshats. Kozlary, as in Ukrainian caption. Next, starring God's perfect idiot. We couldn't use the idiot because this is one of the medical diagnoses in Ukrainian, and this is discouraged. So we used this cute rendition. Казковий доброконик. First film was in Russian, produced by Neva Film, and the film that I show in the beginning, I mean, that was produced by Neva Film because I'm thrilled by what they did. And the Russian version by far did better than us. And because they selected a very appropriate voice to speak those lines, we simply did subtitles, but so I think the Russians are ahead of us here. Sometimes there's something, short phrases, the usual, something like fuck you're old or god damn it, but the translator can make fun of them, such as fuck you're old, prdlo stare, or god damn it, Johannes ban. Great job, I think. Well done, guys. Having said that, let's say they want an airline version of Deadpool film. We would have to discard all these successful attempts on equivalence, where we would have to produce some harmless, rude-less version. We don't have to mention the catastrophes or the disasters. And I'm talking only about the films that are available to watch on board of a flight. Thanks God, this is not the usual orders that we get. And then, God number two, that is, the lip sync. You've seen the funny film they produced. All those people who work on the films are credited even after the music is played at the end of the film. And this is such a shame, whereas the creator of that film, they were punished because they were abandoned by one of their clients. As you heard, lip sync is like God. Everybody knows about him, but nobody has ever seen him. For this video, the lip sync was ideal. and I see that there was some lag between the soundtrack and the visual sequence. So there must be a match between how the lines are articulated. The length of the translation should equal the length of the original. The only exception being the following. Sometimes there is a voice-over line, or the character turns his back on the audience. Sometimes these exceptions are acceptable, but still exceeding lengths are discouraged. If a translated line is longer than the original, you need to make sure that the beginning or the ending doesn't overlap with some sort of sound effect, such as an explosion, or sometimes there's an overlap between the lines of other character. The go-to option for the translator is to repeat this line over and over and tweak it until it fits perfectly with the original length. Vowels articulation must be as close to the original as possible. If they say cucumber, we can't say apple, because it doesn't fit. An R must remain an R or E or E, and vice versa. Ideally, O is O, or sometimes A. What can you do? U must be U or U, but never U or E. There's a limited number of options for those vowels. For example, if a soldier is crying air, we can't really render this as povitra. Well, you clearly see why. We can say lahai instead, if you pronounce it really quickly. And finally, articulatory stops. Oh. Look at the top right-hand corner. You see a letter there. The full stop sounds are b, p, m. Incomplete closures have v and f. And the mismatch in these sounds is obvious to the audience. So simple things become challenges, such as help, for example. Well, apparently the translation is really clear. It says "допоможіть" in Ukrainian, but no. Because help, a very open vowel, whereas "допоможіть" doesn't fit at all. There is no perfect solution, but sometimes you can replace it with the word "рятуйте," and you need to make the emphasis on the final "e." Make sure you pronounce it really fast and emphasize "e" at the end. Admittedly, this word is critical in terms of content. Help has one syllable. In Ukrainian, it's 3 syllables. And usually, they yell it in a close-up. And you can see the face very clearly. And you can see the lips closing on P. Another option is something saying like help, and then whimper in the end. We also have a different word. It's called gwalt. I mean, the audience doesn't receive this word very well. We didn't actually do the research. We didn't do a focus group or something, or a survey nationwide, but we asked the film providers, and they didn't want to have this word. They preferred retuite, for example. We have a word in Ukrainian, fajno, as an equivalent fine, is not an advisable option for a Ukrainian audience. Now, a separate entity is translating poems and songs. Because on top of all those constraints, you have rhythm and the rhyme. This sounds like Mission Impossible, but it actually isn't. It actually is possible. In year 2010, our translator translated film that is... there were only 25 minutes, actually. The Shrek's Christmas, that was called. And it's a poem from the beginning till the end. Look at other examples. The Book of Life, Rio, Trolls, and Smallfoot, released recently, give or take. And our thought god is the deadline, and this is a fearsome god. You have the international release date. No matter what happens in a separate country, you need to hand in the film 2 weeks minimum before the international release, so that digital copies can be made, so that this can be shown and the Ministry of Culture can give its consent. Well, sometimes we do have times to give 2 or 3 weeks to the translator, and then we do review during 1 week, and then a couple of weeks to record, and a couple of weeks to do the mixing, and then coordination, but this doesn't happen, or happens once in a blue moon. Sometimes you have the preliminary version, because we hardly ever get final versions, and there are multiple preliminaries, and the translators translate it without putting the time codes. What is that? On the left you see the original, on the right you see the translation. Well, some text and then some piece of translated. We're not authorized to show work in progress here. You see the original lines, then they're broken down in smaller bits that would be comfortable for saying. You have character names, and before them you see 00, that is minutes, .55, that stands for seconds. Sometimes there's only one preliminary version, and there's no final version. So the go-to version is the preliminary for a translator, and when the final version of the original is received, the translator revises his translation accordingly and inserts the time codes. But sometimes the schedule is very tight, and the customer wants to see the preliminary translation. Now, I'm just going to read this bit, just going to make you laugh. But this is how it really happens. So you get version P01. The translator wants with P2 because he knows the context. And then you get P2 version, the translators translate. Dubbing is made based on P2. Then P3 is received. They removed half of the recorded lines, but added another half. The translators translate the new scripts, remove the old materials. Actors are called again. Warning that this is not the end. The document is re-recorded. No. When the bulk of work is done, you get P4 and the P5 next day, where they remove the part of old lines P3, but added some of the P1 materials that were originally recorded, but they removed. And when the coordinator calls in the actor for P4, you get the version P6. which is a mix of previous version plus a couple of scenes of so-called home porn. And the customer is detained on some border. And then in a week you get P7. The translation sends the translation, thereby cursing us and placing us under his eternal damnation. The team goes white. And then you get the final version. And then you get the final version. And then the first night where we invited the translators to make sure that everything is over, and the next day you get P9, the so-called director's cut. This is the dubbing director after the last stage of this brilliant process. I'm done. Hopefully, my content was meaningful for you. In addition, translating for dubbing is a form of art and is a separate, very important profession, without prejudice to other profession. There were times where brilliant literary translators attempted it, but failed it in view of enormous constraints that are inherent to this type of work. Yet our team of professionals is expanding, and this art lives on. Thank you so much for listening and for responding. I was extremely nervous, actually.
Okay. Do we have any questions?
Yes. Alexei.
Alexei, please. Thank you so much. Where do I stand? I want the best sound, so I'm looking for the best spot. I'm a bit overheated, dehydrated under the sun. So now I have my questions about the obscene language. You mentioned correctly, rightfully, that some genitals are named and sex-related words, but sometimes we use similar words in translation. We were taught to do so. You are talking about dubbing so well, and it's exciting to hear all that. At some point you said that we had only the pirates doing the translation of the games and localization of the games. Usually you get such assignments, translation assignments by hackers. You usually get this hacked file and the long line of all the utterances in original language. And this is a wonderful training for simultaneous interpreters as well. My question now about the film providers. I used to do such translation for films as well, and this experience of mine is really precious to me because now I have this skill of compressing. The douchebag was... Thank you for the equivalent for douchebag, Johannitsban. Then again, douchebag, I recalled this great thing about articulation and adaptation of text when you have to fit the lip movements of the actor on the screen. Douchebag, svolota in Ukrainian, it's wonderful and juicy equivalent. My question. You say the film providers know better. And I remember that when you submit your translation, you have been thinking hard over each and every equivalent, and their feedback sometimes is devastating. Do they study NLP, or is it a rhetoric question? Or I'm just wondering, maybe you know it, and I'm supporting your interesting Ukrainian equivalents. I was trying to be as tolerant as possible when providing the equivalents. Thank you, Iryna. Thank you so much.